Today, we're going to be breaking down the 2003 Daredevil film starring Ben Affleck and also the 2005 Elektra film starring Jennifer Garner, which are very two interesting case studies when we talk about the development of superhero films, especially in the mid 2000s, and also just how they relate to other movies and other franchises that were coming out at that particular time. As we think about these movies together, really as a pair, which is also, I think, a piece of the conversation we'll have to sort of negotiate and talk about specifically in a second here. This is a time where superhero movies are now starting to find somewhat of their footing. The most recent episode, we talked a lot about the X-Men trilogy, how much that particular trilogy achieved in terms of making comic book movies more mainstream, successful, in terms of, where things were with Marvel at that time. They were really finding their footing with the Spider-Man films, which were hugely successful. We started to have some momentum here, and Daredevil in particular was another character that 20th Century Fox wanted to explore. As we dive into this conversation and talk about these two movies, which, Elektra was introduced in the Daredevil movie and then got her own spinoff. But as we talk about these two movies, these two characters in the context of where we are in Hollywood and where we are as an audience, sort of taking these movies in and experiencing them. What's your overall relationship with these two movies? How did you, sort of grow to develop a relationship with them over time? When did you see them? How has it changed over the years in terms of, just how you perceive both Daredevil and Elektra?
Yeah, Daredevil and Elektra are probably some of the more fuzzy ones I think that we'll talk about in our Fox series here. But I do somewhat remember Daredevil coming out and being like, because at this time I really don't know who Daredevil is like that, right? And I'm like, what is this? All I know at this time is that I love Spider-Man. I'm like, Spider-Man is my jam. What Daredevil? Oh, he's a Marvel character. Okay, cool. And so I don't even think I've seen this movie in theaters, if I'm remembering correctly, because again, at this time, I'm going to the movies. I'm young, so I have to go to movies with my family, and I don't think my family was too interested in Daredevil. But everybody knew what Spider-Man was before it came out. But Daredevil comes out, and I just do remember like marketing and Ben Affleck apparently was a thing. Like everyone was like, oh, Ben Affleck's gonna be Daredevil, so on and so forth. And then that's pretty much it, from at least a theater going standpoint. But I first seen Daredevil, I remember probably a year, 2 years after it comes out, DVD era, and I'm watching it and it's hella dark, which is perfect because Daredevil's a really dark movie. But I'm watching it and it's really dark, and I'm like, what exactly is this? And again, as a kid, there's so many things that happen in so many movies that confuse you. Like when you watch Matrix when you're a kid, you're like, what? I don't know exactly everything that's happening, but I know that's cool and that's cool. Daredevil, I remember not necessarily being like too impressed with what was happening, but that's because I was so high on Spider-Man. I'm like, this dude isn't Spider-Man, and that was kind of my relationship with Daredevil. Like, this guy isn't Spider-Man, and because I feel like they operated in the same ways, but Daredevil or Spider-Man just spoke to me, I think, a little bit more. And Daredevil at the time felt so much more gritty and dark, and felt like something I shouldn't be watching. It did feel closer to what Blade was supposed to be. You know what I mean? Did feel more like, that's I don't know if I should be watching this kind of type thing. So I kind of disassociated with Daredevil a little bit more than I think I wanted to. But yeah, that's my early, I think, comprehension of Daredevil. I was like not necessarily feeling the character, but again, I was a kid and so high on Spider-Man, that was my guy. And so Daredevil, when I seen it on TV or I watched it on DVD, it was just a kind of a weird thing for me, being like, this dude, I liked his powers. I was like, this dude's blind and that's cool, but I can't necessarily buy all the way in like I want to.
I mean, this was really at that time. This was Marvel's first attempt at doing a street level hero, right? When we got the X-Men movies, those are dealing with mutants, dealing with pretty fantastical things. Spider-Man is kind of a balance between the street level hero, but also like he can be an Avenger at the same time. You know, we're dealing
Mm-hmm.
with, you know, villains like Goblin and Sandman. So there's still very much high fantasy happening in those movies and within that comic property. Daredevil takes it completely to the streets and goes for a gritty approach, which they hadn't done before. Because also at this time, the Hulk movie from Ang Lee had came out. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, we hadn't really gotten just like the true on the ground hero that just dealt with like low level crime. I did see this in theaters. I was seeing all these movies in theaters at this point.
Mm-hmm.
That was just something that I knew I wanted to do. But seeing the Daredevil movie in theaters and then you know, ultimately walking out, even at that young age, I knew it wasn't reaching the levels of excitement and hype that the other movies like the X-Men trilogy and also the Spider-Man movies were reaching. And I remember it distinctly being disappointed by Daredevil and also Hulk at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Before truly developing like a true sense of taste, you know, in films and
Yeah.
criticism and all these things. Like even as a young kid, it was like, it wasn't that great. It could have been better, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And I didn't know a ton about the character myself at that point, but what I saw
Right.
and what was presented on screen just didn't feel all that great. But this is a movie and a character that made sense at the time, I think, to try to tackle because Daredevil, in the context of other heroes that we had already seen, like Hulk, Spider Man, and the X Men, was probably next on the rung in terms of popularity, largely due to Frank Miller, you know, and what he
Yeah.
achieved in the comic books. Daredevil had also popped up in some of those animated series in the 90s. So I think it made sense, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting thinking about what would happen later in a few years with Marvel Studios, how we got Iron Man and Captain America and the story. And with hindsight, we always say, well, those were like B-level characters, which they were.
Yeah.
I think Daredevil kind of orbits in that same area, but I would still probably place him as being a little bit more popular at that time,
I
more
agree.
popular than Captain America and even Iron
Yeah.
Man, really. And so I think it
Comics,
made,
man.
yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think it
He
made a
was
lot of
popping.
sense to really greenlight a movie to try to tackle this and also stylistically go for something that was going to feel tonally different than a Spider-Man movie or an X-Men movie. But you mentioned you know, sort of Ben Affleck as well. I want to talk about him because he was indeed a star. You know, this was definitely a time where his star was on the rise, and so him being attached to this project was a get. It was a catch for Marvel because he had already won an Oscar for co-writing Good
Mhm.
Will Hunting with Matt Damon. He was also in that movie. He was in front of a lot of people's faces. He did movies like Armageddon and Pearl Harbor with Michael Bay. These were like big, giant movies. Armageddon, obviously a huge movie in 1998, one of the biggest movies of that year, alongside a big ensemble cast, a lot of big stars like Bruce Willis, Michael Clark Duncan also in that movie, so they reteamed here. The second time he teamed with Michael Bay, Pearl Harbor, not so much a success. Definitely had a lot of heat around that. I remember seeing that movie in theaters because a lot of people, you know, wanted to see a movie that talked about it, portrayed Pearl Harbor in the new modern day context. Wasn't that great of a movie, too long. The romance was a little bit awkward. But he was a hot star here. He done other things like Boiler Room. He was in the Jay and Silent Bob movies. Obviously, he's close friends with Kevin Smith. So he was moving and definitely making a name for himself. But also, I think a lot of people knew Ben Affleck because of his romantic relationship with Jennifer Lopez, which was
Mm-hmm.
starting to really take shape at this time. He was dating her. And so a lot of people just knew him for dating J Lo because she was already a huge superstar. He was a star on the rise in Hollywood, and now he's stepping up to the plate to take on this Daredevil character and potentially be a part of a new franchise that ended up not being the case. But after Daredevil comes out, you know, it's a pretty dark time for him in terms of his career because shortly thereafter he drops the movie with J Lo, Jiggly, which was also critically panned, a big commercial and critical flop. And I think for a number of years there, people were like, "This guy's career might be over" before it really got started. We didn't really get a chance to see the best of him. Luckily for him, he wanted to be a filmmaker, and in '07 he directed Gone Baby Gone, a pretty good movie that I think got him back on a lot of people's radars for being like a very competent and quality filmmaker. And then
Mm-hmm.
by 2010, he directs and stars in The Town, and everything changes for him because he just goes on
Yeah.
an incredible run. He's in Argo, wins another Academy Award
Mm-hmm.
for helping produce and star in that movie. He does Gone Girl in 2014, a huge hit. He
Banger.
does another of other films, and then gets casted as Batman in Zack Snyder's universe. You know, all these years later, potentially for a moment of redemption. So it's a really interesting trajectory, especially considering where Daredevil falls in his story, because it felt like that it might have killed his career. What did you think about Ben Affleck? You know, just his maturation and his evolution in Hollywood, considering he played this character, which I think for a lot of people, a lot of actors, it's going to take them to the next level. But because it was so critically panned and unsuccessful, it actually made him take a few backward steps before he was able to come to the forefront again.
Yeah, and what's so crazy, and watching this movie again, is that there's a tons of stars in it who are in different places in their careers now. But Ben Affleck, I think he always had the affinity, like even since Good Will Hunting, for movie making, for filmmaking. I think ever since then, we all should have known he was going to be a star, and a movie like Daredevil shouldn't hold him back. But it does ever so slightly. But I think I knew, it's not going to hold him down for long if you understand like the things that this guy, or you can kind of see the potential that this dude is capable of. And so his career is very respectable, because I think he's always held, I think, such a love for the things that he's done. And I think Daredevil it is kind of it's a risky movie to make. It's a risky movie for yourself to be part of. But like you said, when you're that emerging star, if Daredevil was a hit, he would have been shot to the stratosphere. You know what I mean? In such a different way. I can't even imagine what his career would have looked like if Daredevil was a good movie. But it's very respectable, I think, everything that he's done, and in his love for, again, not only wanting to act, but his love for actually wanting to be a filmmaker, his love for wanting to be behind the camera and do things of that nature. So, man, I respect it, man. Daredevil didn't hold him back, and I'm sure he's proud to say that. And I'm proud to say that too, because it probably created some character after Daredevil. He's like, okay, we can't do that again. And so, like you said, when we get to Batman and his redemption, shoot, hey, let's do it. You know what I mean? I'm all for it. So yeah, it's been kind of cool to watch him.
I mean, you definitely have to become more strategic after something like this. You have to really reassess your
Hmm.
career and think about, like, okay, what is it that I truly want to be? What type of
Hmm.
star, what type of filmmaker, what type of actor do I really want to be? Which takes a long time to figure out. Like, that's not an easy thing to do. And he had a lot of success at a very young age and went through a lot of development. And it's always interesting to like look at his best friend, his business partner, his co-writer on the other side of things, Matt Damon, and look at the choices that Matt was making at that time, where he was taking on not only a franchise with the Bourne series, but then he was also co-starring in the Ocean series and had a lot of
Hmm.
other success with films, but never put on a pair of tights, right? And so what does that mean for, that dynamic and that relationship, how they're sort of moving and maneuvering differently? They're obviously both hugely successful and have both, earned every bit of their way ever since they were working together in those early days. But I find that interesting, the parallels and some of the choices that one can make and how it can take you down a completely different path.
Hmm.
Jennifer Gardner at this time, she's co-starring in this movie. She does make an appearance as Elektra in this movie before getting the spinoff film in 2005. She also worked with Ben on Pearl Harbor. So they reteamed here in Daredevil. I think most people probably knew her because of one of two things: 13 Going on 30, which came out the year before. Elektra, in fact, and then also her time on Alias, the television series that ran for, I think, 5 seasons, from 2001 to 2005. She was one of the leads on that show. But she was also an up and coming actress, very, very beautiful woman, had a great appearance, and also being cast as a character that, if you were into the Daredevil comics, you knew who Elektra was. You knew that this was somebody that
Hmm.
was important to this mythos and could potentially spin off into something that appeared to be, a great, or had a lot of possible ambitions in terms of where they could have taken her in the future. And after she does these movies, her career is also like super interesting too, because she
It
never
is.
like blew up as like a leading actress, but she always
Hmm.
had work. She was always doing things, and she always appeared in movies and has been a part of the public consciousness, for this entire time. But it's also interesting because her and Ben Affleck ended up getting married after their time
Yeah.
working together on Daredevil. They got married in '05. They started dating in '04. Had a friendship, of course. End up having 3 children together. So this is after Ben and J-Lo broke up for the first time. And they go on to have a 10-year marriage and have this family together before getting divorced in 2015. All the while, they're still trying to figure out their places and their work in Hollywood, still taking on projects and things of that nature. But this is a rare case where we're seeing two co-stars, be in a movie together, be in a project together, and then go on to develop into a relationship and a full-fledged family and marriage.
Yeah.
afterwards. What do you make of just Jennifer Garner's career and her trajectory? First appearing in this Daredevil movie, then of course Elektra, which was
Mhm.
even more critically reviled than Daredevil was, and I think really kind of put a stain on her career for a bit there, before ultimately seeing her pop up in other projects down the line.
Man, did they meet on Pearl Harbor? They might have met on Pearl
That was
Harbor,
the first film that they
huh?
worked on together, so
Oh, it's
probably.
one they worked on.
Yeah.
Okay. Man, Jennifer Gardner, like you said, it's so interesting because she never did, like you said, blow up as like this, really big front facing actress, but she has always had work. And in some of the most random movies. I remember to be honest, one of my favorite Jennifer Gardner movies is The Invention of Lying. I think the movie's hilarious. But it's been such an interesting trajectory for her because she will pop up in like a Dallas Buyers Club or like a, I don't know, one of those random movies, Draft Day or something. It's just like, huh, Jennifer Gardner, there you are. Where you been all this time? And every time she pops up though, and I think everybody knows who she is. And there was always so many Jennifers at the time: Jennifer Aniston, Jennifer Gardner, Jennifer Lopez. I was like, all right, y'all, it's so many Jennifers. What is going on here? And it's also funny how history repeats itself because of course they got kids together, but now Ben's back with J Lo again, and like I think there was like something about Father's Day because the kids Ben and Jennifer Gardner were together hanging out with the kids. It's
Yeah.
just
And
crazy
now Ben
how
and
like
J-Lo are about to get divorced again. Like it's about to
it's just
split up
it's
another time.
so crazy.
Yeah.
Like where are we? And then Elektra is about to be in a movie. Whatever, man. I don't know what's happening.
What year is it exactly? Where are we at
What
in the
year is
timeline?
it? Exactly. We're repeating everything. But yeah, Jennifer Garner's always been so interesting to me. And I always I think what she does, but I think she might be not necessarily an example, but she hasn't necessarily always had or been a part of the best movies. And been in the movies I think that can take her career to the next level. And I think she kind of has found a lane to kind of sit there in some way, to kind of sit in the, I'm going to be in this movie, but it may not be the best production. You know what I mean? It may not be the best movie ever. And she's just kind of been there ever since. So yeah, interesting trajectory for her. Again, I still like seeing her. I think anything she's in, she does her best and she usually does pretty good. But yeah, it's just kind of the actress she's become. And that's kind of where she lives at.
And I think it's worth mentioning too that sometimes, especially for women in Hollywood, they get to a place where it's like they want to have families and they want to have kids and they just
Yeah.
want to like settle down. And so she's always working, she's always taking projects, but she's probably not working to the degree of maybe some of her peers because she has 3 kids, right? And she wants to be a
Yeah.
part of their lives. And I think that that's a story that we consistently see with quite a few actresses who at one point in time they're probably hot like a Cameron Diaz or a Gwyneth Paltrow,
Mm-hmm.
but then later in their
Mm-hmm.
life they kind of slow down, and sort of reassess like what they want the next few years of their life to be. Even Angelina Jolie, once she got kids,
Yeah.
we saw her, I think, increasingly and dramatically slow down from producing and making movies. She also
Mm-hmm.
started to just really be, I think, more of a rarity in terms of appearing in front of the screen. So that's a factor. And it's also considerable. And I think we can talk a little bit more about this later with Elektra, but her being a female superhero at this particular time when this wasn't really a thing, like starring and leading a female superhero character and a property, kind of ahead of its time. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out because the movie's not great, but this was not a common thing to occur where we were getting
Yeah.
female fronted comic book movie superhero films. There were only a couple, that we could really pull out as examples. Now there were a lot of female led action movies and female led science fiction movies. That
Mm-hmm.
was not a new thing, and there was definitely frequency and momentum there. I'm thinking about the Kill Bill movies, or thinking about what Charlize Theron was doing at that time. She had the Eon Flux movie. Mila
Yep.
Jovovich, even though those Resident Evil films aren't great, like her as a leading woman did do a lot,
Mm-hmm.
I think, for this particular era. But for superhero films, this was not a common thing. And so it was actually risky, again, for her to not only appear as a co-star in Daredevil, but then to go ahead and greenlight a spin-off film that we would see later. Let's talk about Colin Farrell. This guy, man,
Yes.
I think a
Wow.
consistency amongst these three is the fact that it kind of took them a while to really figure it out. Like they were
Mm-hmm.
all in the same age and demographic at this particular point, had some missteps here and there, but they all eventually found their way. And Colin
Mm-hmm.
Farrell, probably, one of the better examples of that. Now, he was definitely on a bit of a hot streak here. I mean, the year before Daredevil, he was in Minority Report, starring alongside Tom Cruise in a Steven Spielberg movie. Great movie. But
Banger.
then he also
Mm-hmm.
had Phone Booth come out, which, was this nice thriller that I think, allowed him to showcase his ability as a leading man. He
I
goes
was
on to
younger.
do this. It's a way different type of character for him. But then after this, again, it was a few years there where it's like, okay, Colin Farrell know who this guy is, doing some
Hmm.
work. He's in Alexander, he's in SWAT. It's
Yeah.
okay, but it's not clicking. I don't think it's really until probably like the late 2008 or 2009 era when he's in Bruges, and he's in that film. That's just an
Hmm.
incredible movie, starring alongside oh, I forget his name right now, who plays Lord Voldemort. Ray Fiennes. He's starring
Ray
alongside Ray
Fiennes.
Fiennes in
Hmm.
that movie. And then eventually, Colin Farrell still has some missteps here and there, still takes on some remakes that are not probably the most well informed. He does like a Fright Night remake, he does a Total Recall remake. These are just
Fright Night.
not good choices overall, but all in between that, it's like, well, I'm still seeing him pop up. He's still doing interesting things like Seven Psychopaths or The Lobster. Like, it eventually becomes like, oh, this guy is a true thespian actor. Like, the guy is a
Yeah.
really, really great actor. But I think it
Hmm.
just kind of takes a while to get there, specifically after his appearance in Daredevil. Talk about just, your relationship with Colin Farrell from seeing him in this movie. And then, of course, just like everything that evolved with him over the years, after he appeared as Bullseye in this film.
Yeah, well, one again, we haven't gotten to the movie yet, but he's like the craziest part of this movie of Daredevil. But after seeing him in that movie, I think you're right. He does also become an actor that I do see him frequently, and I know who he is. But maybe I'm just I'm not necessarily like, oh shoot, new Colin Farrell movie came out. But every time I watch him, I'm like, dang, this dude is a really good actor. He Miami Vice, I think, when him and Jamie Foxx come out in like '06 or something like that. And it's just like, this dude, like you said, he's a really good actor, but he's never in a lot of these movies, like you said, until like in Bruges, he never feels like necessarily the main character. He's not always, the main character in a lot of these films. He does play a co-star in a lot of these things. And so I know I really liked him, but I knew like at the time, I mean, he still wasn't like one of my favorite actors yet. If that makes sense. But super recognizable. And like you said, it's really not until not even in Bruges necessarily brought me all the way into Colin Farrell. I'm trying to think what movie did brought me all the way in. I mean, it probably just over time something clicked somewhere, and I was just like, yeah, no, I'm a Colin Farrell fan. I don't know what it was, but it's been a really cool, I think, leeway for Colin Farrell to become a star, to get to where we are now with him as the Penguin and the Batman, and him doing all these other really cool movies after Yang, and I think he was in Widows. Yeah, just a lot of cool movies, a lot of things I like, and I like seeing him in particular. Just what a cool actor, man. And what's also funny is after, again, rewatching Daredevil, though, it's like this dude has been killing it from the beginning, kind of, you know what I mean? Like he's always went all the way into his acting, and it's always been so commendable, man. But now, man, now he has like Banshees behind him. This dude he's in another. I think he's entered another stratosphere now. But like you said, it does take him a while, but he works so much. He was coming out like 2-3 movies a year. Like he was really cranking them out, man, and yeah, and I think he'll continue to kind of do that and be that person. But yeah, what a interesting trajectory for him.
Yeah, I think we're just starting to now really see what he's capable of. He's always been a good, talented actor. I always knew that. I wasn't a fan of him, though, in the beginning, because it was like, you feel
Exactly.
like you're all over the place. I just can't really pinpoint like what type of actor you are.
Hmm.
Obviously, here he just goes for it as Bullseye. He is the most cartoonish, over the top character in the entire movie,
For
which is
sure.
distinctly different than the tone that they established in the beginning of the film. But I commend him for doing that. I commend him for just
Hmm.
taking something and just like giving it so much life and so much energy. But at the same time, because he was doing all sorts of genres, working so much, it was like, I don't really know how to pinpoint you. I don't know, what you're good at. It wasn't until like even the late 2000s where I'm like, oh wait, he's Irish. I didn't even know he was like actually Irish. Like I never knew that he was originally
Yeah.
from Ireland and that he had this like really strong accent. It wasn't until like later on where it's like, oh wow, okay,
Hmm.
that actually tells me something about you, and maybe I can like develop more of a relationship. But now he's obviously, I think, one of the most talented, one of the most fun actors and interesting actors to watch. So I really loved how his career evolved. And last but not least, Michael Clark Duncan, the late great Michael Clark Duncan, rest in peace. He's in this movie
Ooh.
as Kingpin. Now he hadn't done a ton of work before this, but most people had already knew who he was because of the Green Mile and his work
Hmm.
in that movie.
Yep.
Starring alongside Tom Hanks, that brought him just so much notoriety, so much fame because he is such a huge and integral part of that story. Obviously, a lot of Academy Award attention, a lot of just awards attention in general. And he had done a couple of other things. He had done some prosthetic work with Planet of the Apes. He was in the Scorpion King with Dwayne The Rock Johnson, his first movie at that particular point. So yeah, I think a lot of people just kind of knew who he was, but to step in as Kingpin, a role that has traditionally been played by white men, you know, European, more traditional white men. This is now a black man coming in and stepping into this role, which was a you
Hmm.
know, I guess quote unquote risky choice at the time to do something like this to race swap the character. But when you look at Michael Clark Duncan, the guy is 6'5", 320 pounds. It's like,
It makes
yeah,
sense.
you're built exactly how I envision Kingpin to be. And he's also like
Yeah.
more muscular than he is like fat on his body. Like the guy is
Hmm.
very intimidating from a physicality standpoint. And he comes in and he does this movie. Probably doesn't do him a ton of favors, but I would wager that he's actually like one of the better parts of this movie, a movie that
Yep.
isn't that successful in many regards, but he gives a very interesting Kingpin Wilson Fisk take. And I think one of the drawbacks of the Daredevil movie is that we just don't see enough of him. We could have gotten a
Hmm.
lot more, and that's going to be a consistent theme I think we talk about. But what did you think about just Michael Clark Duncan obviously stepping into this role, which was traditionally portrayed by white men, but then also just the fact that he did come in and sort of own it and provide his own take, and maybe was one of the better aspects of the movie overall.
Yeah, I think everybody in that movie, again, which is crazy, they all ended up doing some, a lot of other things. But I think after the Green Mile, part of me even, thinks like this dude, he was trying to go in here, or shoot, after all those movies, Scorpion King, Planet of the Apes, whatever he was in, but he knew that this race swap thing was going to be like a thing, I think. And he was like, I got to come, I got to get my energy. Like, I got to be Wilson Fisk in this thing. And I absolutely agree. He is one of the better parts of the movie, and we don't see enough of him. But also, sometimes that's what worked. And like, he had a presence over the film. And Michael Clark Duncan is so good, I think, at you remembering him no matter what he does on screen. Like I haven't watched The Green Mile in a while, bro, but there's always images of parts of the movie with him in it just embedded in my head because he's that memorable. What he does on screen is that memorable. And I think, that reigns true here. Again, not damn near not even close as good of a movie, but I remember him as Kingpin in the movie for sure. Cause how could I forget? Earlier talking about relationships with the film. When I first seen Daredevil, I was like, the black dude's one of the villains. You know what I'm saying? Again, you're a young kid. You don't necessarily see that too often, especially not in a mainstream comic book film. And so his portrayal definitely stuck with me and will continue to stick with me because I thought it was pretty good. And like you said, I wish we did get more of him though, at the end of it all.
Absolutely. So as I sort of started off with, this movie comes out a very interesting time for Marvel and all of the studios that they're working with. By 2003, we had a Blade movie that was modestly successful and definitely loved by the people that saw it. We had an X-Men movie come out that did enough to generate a new franchise. We had a Spider-Man movie that became essentially the most successful comic book movie of all time at that particular point when it dropped. So 2003, we get X-Men 2, we get
Hmm.
Hulk, and we get Daredevil. Daredevil is actually the first one to come out of all of those movies. It comes out
Hmm.
Valentine's Day of 2003. Hulk comes out, I think, that June. X2 comes out in May later in the summer. So those were big summer tent poles. But now, because of the response and I guess the lack of success to this of this movie,
Yeah.
even though it was produced on a modest budget, it only cost $78 million, ended up making $179 million, double its budget, but still not setting the world on fire necessarily. You
Hmm.
follow that up just a couple of short years later with Elektra, which was both a critical and commercial failure, pretty much by all accounts. Now, I think as audience members, as fans of these characters and of this material, we are facing the very likely possibility that, oh man, these movies aren't working, or at least there's a certain demographic, a certain corner of these movies that just aren't working. We had not reached the height of what comic book films would later go on to achieve, where it felt like damn near everything that was coming out was a success, and it was super successful with fans, and it resonated. This particular era, I remember distinctly, it always been kind of a 50-50 toss up. Like, it might be great, or it just might be like some of the worst
Hmm.
stuff we've ever seen.
Yeah.
Especially in the mid 2000s, where there were just a lot of other franchises that were starting to really find their footing. Harry Potter was the most successful thing at this time. Lord of the Rings and Pirates of the Caribbean, like, these were the more successful franchises as opposed to superhero films. And I think what's interesting about Daredevil and then later Elektra is that they started to kind of develop like the idea of what a comic book movie flop would really mean in this context and in this era. We had experienced it before, of course. Batman and Robin is a stain on
Hmm.
humanity entirely, but now that we started to see these things happen a little bit more frequently, the Fantastic Four movies, it's like, not that great.
Mm.
It's like, okay, now we're starting to maybe be on a little bit of shaky ground. I mean, do you remember just like how you felt as a fan at this time? Of course, like seeing this movie eventually, even after it hit theaters, and just knowing like, yeah, we can't always depend on these movies to kind of get it right. We either
Yeah.
have to revert back to the comics or maybe an animated series. Like, this was not really the destination for comic book media that would, I think, ultimately it would galvanize people to rally around them and say like, yeah, we can't wait until that next Marvel movie. It wasn't really like that at this time.
Nah, it wasn't. And it, I think in some ways from the beginning, you know, these Marvel films kind of had to get it right more than other people. It was all always like walking on eggshells in a way. Like, it was like, oh, y'all messed up. How many times y'all got to mess up? Oh, you messed up again, because we speak about how niche it was at this time. Of course, we talk about how successful Blade was and Spider-Man was, but they're still niche. Like, they're not the MCU how it is now. MCU is not even niche. It's like the thing. And so, at this time, it always feels like, ooh, we can't keep doing this over and over. Ooh, it's like in Daredevil felt like the beginning of that, for sure. You kind of spoke to what was good before then with Blade and Spider-Man and X1, and then later X2, and then Daredevil hits. It's like, whoa. All right, okay, maybe that's just one. Maybe that's just one, but Daredevil did kick it off. You know what I'm saying? Daredevil was like, okay. Then the Hulk comes out. We're like, whoa again. What is going on here? Two wild takes. Two wild takes for these things. And so 2003 was just a rough year for comic book movies, man. It was. And again, Daredevil kind of started kind of, I don't know, it was a complete downward trend, right? Because like you said, the Fantastic Four movies were like, they kind of fit in the middle somewhere. You know what I mean? They're like, they're watchable, but we're not going to go see it more than one time in the theater or anything. You know what I mean? It's nothing like that. And so it's just, I don't know, it's interesting how it was so hard to make some of these movies after a while, and it's kind of always been some of the more beloved characters you could do better, and maybe they pay attention to more. Daredevil wasn't, of course, he was beloved by comic book fans, but the masses didn't know him, so maybe it wasn't enough there. You know what I mean? Same thing with uh, 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 people love the Hulk. That's one I was like, whoa, maybe we shouldn't have maybe we shouldn't have done that, or I don't know how we were supposed to figure out the Hulk. But Daredevil was a little bit more in the corner. A lot of people didn't know who Daredevil was. So yeah, it's a crazy time, and I agree. It was up and down. You don't know what you were going to get in this era. You don't know if you were going to get one of the coolest comic book movies you've ever seen, or one of the worst comic book movies you've ever seen. So yeah, they had to tread lightly, and I think that, but also because of that, I think there were also some fails in there.
I mean, the big thing that I just noticed across in hindsight, rewatching a lot of these movies, the tonal inconsistency across all of them is
Yeah.
so detrimental to our relationship with them, and
Hmm.
what Marvel Studios would later provide with the birth and the kicking off of the MCU was consistency, not only from a story perspective but from a tonal perspective. You just knew what
Hmm.
to expect once you got to a certain point within the MCU. But here, because we have all the studios in Hollywood with their hands in the pot. You got Sony making Spider-Man, you got 20th Century Fox making Daredevil and X-Men, you got Universal making Hulk. Like, nobody's speaking to each other, nor should they.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're making their own properties, but Marvel at this time, they were just optioning off their characters to get some
Yeah,
to get some
money.
cash because they were
Mm-hmm.
facing bankruptcy. So there wasn't really any consistency across these projects. They would just be all over the place, you know, and that just lent itself to, I think, distinct and different experiences for every single film that came out. As we dive into Daredevil here, this movie had been worked on since 1997. 20th Century Fox, they had the rights and they optioned the rights from Marvel, and initially Chris Columbus was set to direct the film adaptation of Daredevil. Chris Columbus, by this point already hugely successful, directed the Home Alone movies, you know, which were some of the most successful movies at that time. Would have been interesting if he took this movie, because it would have kept him busy, and he would not have directed the Harry Potter films. He directed the first two, Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets, really setting the stage for that franchise. So that would have just completely changed his trajectory at that particular time. As we just mentioned, Marvel was facing bankruptcy in 1998. And 20th Century Fox, they allowed their option on the character to expire, and basically negotiations began to reacquire the rights, but those negotiations failed to work out. So Marvel had set up the project initially with Columbia, so this was going to be the same production studio that was working on Spider-Man. A script had been developed, but it eventually didn't work out. Columbia decided to cancel the project in 2000. They couldn't come to an agreement over the digital rights of the film. New Regency steps in, enters the negotiations, and they obtain the rights in 2000 to produce the movie with 20th Century Fox. And eventually, 20th Century Fox is the studio that would end up distributing the film. They set the budget at $78 million, so very, very modest compared to some of its peers. Cost less than the X-Men movie, cost less than the Spider-Man movie, but it makes sense. I think it's a street-level hero. Eventually, filming began in March of 2002. They went to Canada to save money, to cut back on just what it would cost, which we saw as a consistent thing. We talked about those X-Men
Mm-hmm.
movies. They all filmed in
Yep.
Vancouver, to just keep
Yep.
budgets low. And basically, one of the appeals of the movie that the cinematographer of the film, Erickson Core, talked about that really drew him in was the fact that the appeal of the movie came from these, quote, beautiful old brick buildings and great rooftops, which they felt were perfect for the depiction of Hell's Kitchen. And so they tried to really recreate Hell's Kitchen in their shooting and their filming in Montreal and Vancouver, which I think is an interesting thing to unpack here. It's just like the look of the movie. As you talked about, Daredevil is a grittier, more grounded character, and
Mm-hmm.
we're tackling a distinct environment that's going to be totally different than what we see out of a Spider-Man, where he's swinging
Yeah.
from skyscraper to skyscraper in Manhattan. Knowing that the Matt Murdock Daredevil character is very much rooted in Hell's Kitchen, which means
Mm-hmm.
he's mostly doing his crime fighting at night. He's mostly traversing rooftops. He's dealing with low-level thugs and criminals, and then he's daylighting as a lawyer, you know, essentially. What did you think about just like how they were able to sort of create those visual distinctive differences in this character as opposed to what we might have seen in other properties, because it was such a street level type of hero?
Yeah, you know, they did their best, and a lot of it was just, you know, they looking for those rooftops that they wanted, in making it dark, or having Daredevil perch on a corner of something. And I think you can tell what they were trying to do, in a lot of the action scenes, even the action scene in the street, with Elektra's dad and Bullseye and all of that. You're like, oh yeah, this is really dark, but it didn't always necessarily feel like, I think, the Hell's Kitchen that they wanted it to feel like. And I don't, and that could be a, you know, for a number of reasons, maybe production design, I don't know. But that they did what they could, I think, in some of those moments, and I think I understand what they were going for, though. You know, you talk about Spider-Man having to be both kind of the street level and, you know, some of those more fantastical Avengers almost level threats. And then, but they kind of had those examples. They had Blade on the Street too already to kind of pull from. You had Spider-Man kind of on the street too to kind of pull from. They said, okay, how can we do that but make it Daredevil? And I don't think it necessarily always worked out, but I do think that's one thing they got close to right in rewatching the Daredevil movies, is like, okay, that's how dark that's supposed to be. Okay, I see. It probably rained like 3 times too much in the movie for sure, but like, I do see what they were going for, though. They were trying to make a darker, grittier take on a character. And yeah, that's just they did their best. That's all I can say. They did their best.
Yeah, they tried for sure. It doesn't always work out. I think you can see the flashes of influence from other properties. Like there's like kind of a little bit of the iconography from the Sam Raimi movies, like the rain sequence when he's like facing off with
Exactly.
Jennifer Garner. It's like that feels very much like Sam Raimi. But then also there's like more goofy things that happen, like the suit up moments where it's like that's Joel Schumacher Batman right there. Like when we see him suiting up and we're zooming in on the ass and the armpit and the zip ups and all of that stuff. It's like that's Schumacher, which all of that stuff feels super campy now, but that was very much like something as a trope that was embedded in a lot of these movies when they initially came out. But I think that that's like, again, another big drawback of this movie is the fact that it just really is tonally all over the place, both visually and characterization wise and story wise. Like it doesn't really land on something distinctive and unique in its own right. From a visual perspective, there's some scenes I like where it's like darkly lit. We definitely get some of those back alleys and, you know, sort of the wet streets of New York that they're trying to recreate, the
Right.
rooftops. Like, okay, that's interesting. I see what you're going for. But then there's other moments where it's like, this is overly stylized for no reason. Like the courtroom scene, or several of the courtroom scenes, like we're using Dutch angles, like the saturation is at a ridiculous level. Like there's filters.
Yeah.
It's like, what are we going for here? I just don't know what to make of it. I don't know what we're trying to achieve. But also, what's interesting about this movie is like when we're dealing with Daredevil's power set, like he is blind, right? And
He is blind.
the communication and illustration of some of those powers was also kind of a unique thing. Like we're trying to figure out a way to visualize his senses, which hadn't really done before. Like how does Daredevil see the world because he can't see? And we're trying to use sort of the echo location, and we're trying to visualize that, like that stuff. I thought that those were interesting choices. Again, not always super successful, and we were somewhat limited because of technology at the time,
That's true.
in terms of what we could achieve. But they were going for some things that I feel like, okay, I respect the direction there. It just didn't always necessarily work when they tried that stuff out. But you know, I think it's one of those things where again we had to get a little bit further along in really understanding what the character was and what he was going to be, because I think the big thing about the film, regardless of like quality or some of the, you know, goofier moments, is just the fact that it really just feels all over the place. You know, at one moment we're super serious, it feels very grounded, and then you see Bullseye come on screen from Colin Farrell, and he is just, I mean, it's like Ringling Brothers when he comes into the movie. He's like he's flicking fucking paper clips in old ladies' mouths and stuff. It's like, and he's almost like having a high off of it. It looks like he's having an orgasm when he does that. He's just like so excited, you know. And there's even the sequence. I mean, this is probably the most reviled sequence in the movie when Daredevil Matt Murdock, at this point he's not costumed up, when he first meets Elektra in the movie, and they have this weird showdown at this basketball court, and they're balancing on seesaws and they're using kung fu against each other. It's like, what movie is this now? Like what are we doing? I mean, what, rewatching the film, like how do you you know, sort of negotiate those things and just, you know, take them all in? It's like, well, once we were here and it feels super serious, and then now we're just like in completely campy, fantastical territory.
Yeah, they were trying to, it's the way they were trying to embed, I think, the romance into the film, and they made it so silly. It's one of those things where, like you said, you're trying to have this like dark and gritty movie where, again, it's raining a lot, the streets are wet, Daredevil's flipping off buildings at nighttime, and then like him and Elektra are, you know, playing footsies in the middle of the park, like, and it's so crazy because that whole scene is ridiculous. Like the kids, I know they see it as a blind man, and nobody went to go tell anybody a blind man is out here fighting. Like nobody put two and two together. I don't know. That was just crazy. Like he should be a phenomenon, internet or not. Like he should have been in the papers. It should have been a whole thing that this guy is. And yeah, just so silly. They're flirting as they're fighting, and the cuts are ridiculous. And again, Catwoman comes out a year later, right? You got to talk about Catwoman in the basketball court scene, because they're so comparable. The Catwoman scene is worse.
Yeah,
for sure.
For sure, yeah.
But they feel very similar in how ridiculous they are, and how neither one kind of matches the movie. Catwoman was also supposed to be a little bit darker. She was a nighttime vigilante and trying to do these things. And then it's like, what is this basketball court scene? Maybe we just need to leave basketball courts out of these superhero films. That might help everybody, especially basketball courts with kids. who apparently don't know what's happening. Oh, there's a fight going on. And then like it's a blind man fighting this girl. It's just too much, man. It's such a weird moment in filmmaking for both of those movies. I don't know what they were trying to do.
I think I think the big issue that we see in this movie, especially, we also see it in the X-Men movies. We kind of briefly talked about this in our X-Men rewatches, but I think on the part of executives and people who were involved in these films, there's a simultaneous embarrassment, but also an embracement of the comic book source material. Like we're partially embarrassed by it. We don't want to put them in yellow spandex. We don't want to put them in these overly bright, colorful costumes. We don't want to embrace every element of it. But let's take like certain things from comics and try to like put that in the movie because comics do have some very silly things in them sometimes. They do often have, you know, those really funny moments, those hilarious moments, and to try to put that in a movie that feels like it's going to be much more of a gritty crime drama, it just wasn't probably the best choice. And maybe we should have just leaned completely into what it was going to be from the get-go. Like, this is a dark, sometimes tragic, sometimes deeply disturbing movie, you know, about a guy who's dressing up at night to fight crime in Hell's Kitchen. Maybe we should have just leaned all the way into that, as opposed to trying to find a way to have a little bit more broad appeal. And I think that's what they tried to do here with like the inclusion of Elektra, trying to appeal to women who probably weren't into comics at this time, trying to appeal to other sensibilities and be a little bit more broad for audiences and families and kids that were going to come. But you can't always have that both ways. Or if you do, you have to be very, very talented at striking that balance, which they just couldn't figure that out here, because that basketball court sequence, it's the most ridiculous part of the movie. It's just it's completely, it doesn't make any sense within the context of the story that they were telling. Did you also notice, I never knew this, but like, what is the weird thing that they're doing with Jennifer Garner's eyes? Like the green eyes, I don't know what happens, but there's like several moments, and it's interesting because she naturally has green eyes, but there's several moments in the movie where they like accentuate the color in her eyes, and
they saturate them hoes.
I don't understand, like, why are we doing that? I mean, of course, again, she has natural green eyes. They might not be the most green eyes you've ever seen, but for whatever reason, in certain scenes, we accentuate it, we oversaturate the color. It looks like some CGI is applied. Other times, it's not there. It was one of the more distracting things that I noticed, and I was just like, what the fuck are we doing here? Like, why is this even a part of the movie?
Especially if from the view of our protagonist, he cannot see her eyes. Like, that's the like, I'm like, what are we doing here? You know, this dude is blind, right? He wouldn't even be able to get close to being able to see where her eye color is, especially his is like, you know, the blind grayed out bluish looking color or whatever. It's almost like they were trying to make it the opposite. Like, oh, his eyes are colorless, hers are the most saturated. You know, I think that's like kind of what they were trying to do. And it's so weird to see it, because like you said, she does have natural green eyes. So what are we doing? Is that their take on a comic booky thing? Do you think like making her eyes that green is like, oh, this is a comic booky thing? I mean, they did put a bullseye in the middle of Colin Farrell's head. You know what I'm saying? That's pretty going for it. So maybe that's one of Elektra's things, is her eyes are hella green sometimes. You know, just like when it rains, she starts to glow, according to him. The ESP can see her glowing in the rain. Maybe that's a super comic booky thing to them. And maybe her eyes were the same. It was weird. I agree. It was distracting. I thought I was the only person that noticed. I love that you brought it up, because I was like, what? That wasn't like that a second ago. Yeah, I thought it was just me, man.
It fucking sucks. I just don't get it. It stands out so much now, just because you know, we're watching these things in high definition, you know, 1080p these days, sometimes 4K, and it's like, well, that's glaringly obviously some CGI there. Like, what the hell? But you know, one of the wins of this movie that I think is somewhat slept on, that we don't talk about enough, but I think it's definitely an unequivocal win. Even though it tonally, again, it doesn't really fit within the movie, but it's the soundtrack. The soundtrack to this movie is a banger. This was, I believe, the first collaboration between Marvel Entertainment and Wind Up Records. Now, Wind Up Records at that particular time, a pretty popular recording studio, recording label for artists in the late 90s and early 2000s. their most popular artists were Evanescence and Creed, and they
Yep.
also had a number of other artists, but they started this collaboration with Marvel to do the soundtracks for their movies. And so they would eventually create the soundtrack for Daredevil. They would also work on the soundtrack for Fantastic Four, as well as The Punisher and Elektra. And at this particular time in history, I know this, distinctly because there was this new rock movement that was happening, this new metal movement that was happening with bands like Evanescence, Creed, Saliva, Nickelback. Like there was a distinct
Mm-hmm.
style of music that was largely being associated with these movies. But also, if you were a professional wrestling fan, you also knew a lot of WWE music was also incorporating these bands into their theme musics, into their pay-per-view themes. Like some of these songs would just reappear all the time. But
Yeah.
Evanescence and their song "Bring Me to Life" kind of
Mm-hmm.
had its big moment in this movie. This was like the first mainstream thing that attached that song to a soundtrack. And because of its inclusion here, it ended up going #1 on the Billboard charts. It was a super successful song.
Crazy.
And also, like, now fast forward 20 years later, people look back fondly on that song. Like, that song has a distinct place in pop culture. When you hear "Bring Me to Life" come on, it's like, oh my God, I'm in 2003 again. Like I'm all of a sudden a young kid again, who grew up with that song. What do you think about just the fact that like music was kind of playing an integral part in this story? And although the film wasn't that successful, it did lend itself to having like this new metal hard rock stylistic edge to it because it was going for a more grittier, crime driven take on the character.
Yeah, I think it's one of the more accurate things about the film. Again, not for the time period and for the tone, man. I mean, Evanescence, 2003 is hot. You know what I'm saying? It's like, especially that kind of music is what people want to hear. And it just works for the film, man. In the moment, in all the moments that you hear Evanescence in the film, it's like, yeah, Daredevil. Yeah. It's like, yeah, no, this thing is cracking. So I agree. It's definitely a win for the film. And it's in my rewatch, I was like, man, this thing is jamming. This is crazy. And I'm sure again at the time everyone's thinking the same thing, but just going back and watching it and seeing, I think the legacy that Evanescence has, like how much people love Evanescence today from those times, from the remembrance or the nostalgia of what was happening at that time, man. It's a really kind of cool thing to see, because even me watching, I was like, wait, Evanescence, I know these songs. Wake me up inside. I was like, yeah, no, this stuff is jamming. So yeah, bro, it's great to see, and it's for sure one of the better parts of the movie.
Fucking song slaps. It's amazing.
It's crazy.
And it's aged beautifully. I love it.
Yeah.
Did you rewatch the theatrical cut or the director's cut?
Oh, I had to do directors.
So let's talk about that, because the director's cut is 30 minutes longer than the theatrical cut. It's crazy how much material is added back. Now, when I saw this in theaters, of course, it was the theatrical cut. That movie's about an hour and 43 minutes. It's pretty brisk. I didn't see the director's cut probably until 10 years later. Eventually, I did end up buying this movie on Blu-ray or something like that, and it included the director's cut. And I remember watching it at that time, and I'm like, this is better than I remember. It's still not great, but it's definitely better than I remember. And then doing some, deeper dives and research and finding out like, oh wow, 30 minutes. That's significant. That's a huge chunk of time for a movie. And they added in so much stuff. And also, what's very different between the director's cut and the theatrical cut. Theatrical cut is rated PG-13. The director's cut is rated R. So it's a lot more violent, a lot more blood, a lot more things that are involved, from a gritty perspective in that. But also there's a whole subplot in the director's cut that's just not in the theatrical cut at all. There's a character, Dante Jackson, in the director's cut played by Coolio. Rest in peace to him. But we get this whole subplot where, he's accused of murder, and, Matt Murdock and Foggy, played by Jon Favreau, we'll get to him in a second. They're defending him, and they're going on this whole, sort of investigation. Now, what I think is really, really interesting about this movie, even with the director's cut, even with 30 minutes added back in, we just don't get enough of Matt Murdock as a lawyer.
Yeah.
That's just like one big missing piece of it. And we know how important that is to his character. And we saw a lot of that later on in the Daredevil series. But what do you make about just those differences between, how it just reshapes our understanding of the film? We've seen this happen a couple of times. I think one of the more notable comps in superhero films is, the Snyder Cut, of course, with Justice League, but also the Ultimate Edition for Batman v Superman. I remember very much disliking that movie in theater, seeing it, being very disappointed by it. You see the Ultimate Edition, it's like, that would have been really good to know when I saw this movie 4 months ago in theaters. Like, I wish this plot was kept in, because sometimes it does add a lot more context information. So, how do you feel about just the fact that the director's cut, I think for a lot of people, has grown to have a little bit more appreciation over the years throughout history, as opposed to what we saw initially come out in theaters?
Yeah, that idea that we get, this whole different subplot with Coolio, with the whole court case, is, it speaks to who Matt Murdock is. It's something that our Netflix show that we have with Charlie Cox is so good at. Of course, they have the time to do so. They have the time to be like, look, y'all, this dude's a lawyer and he's gonna take this case and this case, and then he's Daredevil. And in a lot of times, that what makes Daredevil work is he's Matt Murdock first and then Daredevil. And I think that's one of the things this movie kind of gets wrong, is he's Daredevil and then he's Matt Murdock, and it's a little backwards, I think, in that way. But that extra footage just helps. It helps the context. It helps that Matt has somebody to defend, because in a theatrical cut, it's like, yeah, I'm a lawyer. Okay, what else? Like, what's happening? And even in some of the footage we do get from the case with Coolio's character, remember, there's like the Jon Favreau was like, he's having to do the thing by himself. Foggy got to kind of do the thing by himself because Matt's not there,
and fails miserably. He's just
fails
not that great without him.
But it's like, where the hell is Matt Murdock? You know what I'm saying? So it's so interesting, because you add 30 minutes, but it's like, damn, still not enough Matt Murdock, to a certain degree. But at least that subplot, it injects a different, I think, piece of the story that resonates with people a little bit more as Matt on the ground, because we do like seeing our superheroes live normal lives when they can. That is something we all, I think, appreciate in some of the best, in some of the best superhero films. And yeah, I think a little bit of that extra footage definitely helps. That's in even that subplot where Matt is investigating a little bit more about the murders that leads all the way to Kingpin. Some of that stuff is just more appreciated. It's like, yeah, that definitely should have been in the movie. If King, you know what I'm saying? Why would that not be in the movie? So yeah, the 30 minutes of definitely helps for sure.
I'm the humanity of the characters is essential to the success of these movies. They don't work without that. And Marvel Studios, once the MCU got going, that is why they became so successful. We're more focused on Tony Stark. We're more focused on Steve Rogers. We're more focused on Bruce Banner, as opposed to the superhero alter egos that they have. Of course, we love that stuff. We want to see the action. We want to see the costumes, all that big bombastic stuff. But the humanity of them, their real lives, where they come from, and then how they grow and evolve to be heroes, that's what makes those films so successful. And if you remove that, if you take a lot of that stuff away, it just doesn't work really. It just doesn't feel the same, because you don't develop that connection with them. And that's why we see Charlie Cox is such a beloved take on the Matt Murdock character, because we spend so much time with him and Foggy Nelson and Karen Page. We see him just living life. We see a lot of that backstory, that origin story, his relationship with his father. All of that stuff is just so critical to allow him to grow and evolve into to being the man without fear, to being this hero that's fighting crime. And so, at the time, though, we just hadn't cracked that code, that piece of the puzzle. It just wasn't a priority, I think, for a lot of these studios, because our sensibilities as an audience, they were developing in real time. Like, we didn't know what was successful in terms of comic book films. We had only a couple of examples, like the Batman movies in the 90s. Like, how much Bruce Wayne stuff are we really getting?
Exactly.
Not a ton. It's mostly focused on Batman. I love Michael Keaton. He's always going to be my favorite, but we don't get a ton of Bruce Wayne from him. Same thing with Val Kilmer and George Clooney. It's all about the suit. It's all about the costumes and the toys and the gadgets. Then Chris Nolan comes along and is like, well, wait, Bruce Wayne is a man. This is a person. This is a guy with real trauma, that we can unpack and talk about. And it just took a couple of filmmakers. It took a couple of times at bat to get there and to figure that out. And so it was interesting that they were touching on that stuff here, but they just didn't fully dive in. I think that there was still some hesitancy to allow themselves to say, like, well, maybe the audience does want to see this stuff, because we do, and we need that in order to grow this relationship. But also in the director's cut, it is more brutal and more violent. There's a couple of scenes with Kingpin that are included. He's killing people, and it's like very brutal. I think the final confrontation between him and Daredevil at the end is also very brutal and violent. Just quickly, what do you think about just that as well? Because at this point, I don't know if we had any rated R comic book movies outside of Blade. Like that was the one, which makes sense. It's vampires, has to have a lot of blood in it. But we were very much going for broad appeal in these movies, and they cut this down to make it a PG-13 movie as opposed to rated R. Fast forward 10 years, Daredevil on Netflix, very violent, very much bloody and gory. They're leaning all the way into it. What do you make of that? The fact that I guess at that time maybe we just, I don't know if we weren't ready. I think we were definitely ready for it, but the studios probably just didn't want to take that that complete dive into venturing into more graphic, more gory territory with the story.
Yeah, it's almost like, and it's probably not even almost, this is exactly what it was, but they wanted to level up Daredevil to a big like name superhero, and they kind of, not that it's not a big name, but you know what I'm saying, like the scale which Daredevil is, he's not that. And we've been talking about, I think constantly has been a theme that we've been talking about. There were two in between in these films where, like, imagine if Daredevil did just like its influence was just Blade, rated R, keep the grittiness. There's not there is a small romance in it, but it's not silly. You know what I'm saying? It sticks to the tone of the film. We might be talking about a different Daredevil movie if they had just leaned all the way into that instead of the mass appeal portion that you were speaking to, because the violence being more brutal in a Daredevil movie makes so much more sense. He's closer to the ground. I don't know why this kid's at a basketball court. No, go away. Like, that's not supposed to be there. We need this is what it's supposed to be. It should be more brutal. There's part of the additional footage where like Bullseye kisses Electro on the lips while he's stabbing her. I was like, this is crazy, but also like, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, that's some crazy sadistic stuff going on there. So it's like, man, I just wish they leaned all the way into it, because the violence being a little bit more brutal in that extended cut, or in the director's cut, is like, it makes sense, and it should have probably been there all along.
Even the language too. There's like a scene that was altered with Bullseye in the theatrical cut. He says, "I want a bloody costume," but in the director's cut,
give him one.
They don't give him one. But then in the director's cut, he's like, "I want a fucking costume." So it's like just even small cosmetic changes like that. It's like, okay, but yeah, we never really get a true proper costume from him. If you know the comics, Bullseye wears it's kind of like a onesie costume. It's definitely like very much crazy. But they try to make it as realistic as possible, even though he has a literal bullseye carved in his head on his face. It's crazy. But yeah, no, I agree. It's just like one of those things where it's like, man, you just hope that the bravery on the part of the filmmakers is there. And I think that we just lacked a lot of that at this time. There just wasn't enough bravery. There wasn't enough creative risks within these small choices that actually end up being very, very significant to the end product. Even something as seemingly insignificant as Hugh Jackman's hair in the original Wolverine, Kevin Feige, that's like now a famous story where he's the one that pushed for the hair to be more reminiscent of the comics, whereas like the studio was like, no, that's goofy, that doesn't make sense. But now like we can't see him without that,
Exactly.
And it's those filmmakers, it's those people that are involved that you need to have a part of that have a loving appreciation for the source material to know how to, make certain changes, yes, and adapt and do what you need to do and take some creative liberties, but also to not be as fearful, to go ahead and lean into like what makes the character so special. And in the case of Daredevil, it's like, this is a dark, brutal character. Like, we need to have that violence be a part of the story. There's really no way around it. Want to quickly acknowledge Jon Favreau in this movie, who plays Foggy Nelson. I don't know, man. When I watch this movie, I am kind of distracted by Jon Favreau's presence in this film. It's really strange just knowing that, he would go on to not only direct Iron Man and kick off the MCU with Robert Downey Jr. and Kevin Feige, but he would star in those movies as Happy Hogan. And he's become such a fixture for such a long time. He's been a part of the MCU since the beginning. And, we've grown our relationship with that particular franchise. And you go back and look at this movie and it's like, oh my God, like Jon Favreau is playing, the opposite of Ben Affleck. Now, respectfully to Jon Favreau, he was already pretty well known. He was a director and a filmmaker at this time. He had done movies and had been in movies before. He was also, frequently acting. So it wasn't strange for him to be acting in a movie. But I think just in the context of like the story of Hollywood, the story of comic book movies, in hindsight, you go back and look and it's like, yo, what? This is crazy how it all worked out and how it happened.
Yeah, even in my rewatch of The Sopranos, remember that episode where Jon Favreau,
Yes,
he's like, yeah,
he just randomly pops up on. They're making a movie.
They're making a
Yeah.
movie, yeah. And I think about that too. It's just funny all this is happening in hindsight, but even with that context, it's like, dude, why are you here? It's just it's so crazy to see him, and like you said, it is distracting because he's just happy Hogan now, or you know what I mean? He's not this anymore. He's definitely not Foggy Nelson. But on top of that, I have a different Foggy Nelson now. You know what I'm saying? Even in watching this, I do have Charlie Cox in my head as Daredevil now, not Ben Affleck. So like, it was a lot of distractions kind of going on now because there are different characters that are current, you know, that stick to the role. But yeah, man, seeing Jon Favreau, it was weird. Every time I see him, because he did have a decent amount, you know, of time, and he was comedic relief too, in some ways, which Happy does do. He is comedic relief. So it was definitely weird going back and seeing him here.
Yeah, no doubt. So this movie for me, when I watch it, specifically the director's cut, I like how the movie starts. I hate the middle of it, and I actually kind of like how the movie ends. Like the movie ends on a pretty big, you know, action sequence, you know, between Daredevil, Bullseye, and then eventually Kingpin. Any thoughts on that? Because I found, you know, just rewatching it, it was like a lot happens. They try to do too much for sure, you know, and try to resolve all of this quickly, but I did find myself kind of appreciating just the sequence of events, like the fight between Bullseye. Elektra does die in this movie, technically. They try to incorporate a lot of the church iconography that we associate with Daredevil, the Catholicism, you know, aspect of it. And then he eventually faces Kingpin, you know, at his headquarters at Fisk Tower. Again, probably too much that they try to jam into this movie. It's all over the place. And they try to, you know, incorporate so many elements of the Daredevil character in a very short amount of time. But again, you know, taking the movie with a grain of salt, obviously knowing how it's just grown and evolved and changed over the years and having somewhat of an appreciation for it. I was like, oh, you know, they actually had a pretty dramatic, weighty third act to this movie that you know, sort of had these big action moments and sequences and choreography and fights. And so, yeah, just what did you think about, you know, the third act? And then also just like, I guess the general fight choreography throughout the entire movie, because that is like another very, very key component to the Daredevil character.
Yeah, I really wish the third act was kind of similar to how the movie should have went. Just a normal, you got a court case with Matt Murdock. It's tied to Kingpin. Things happen all in between. At the end, he has to fight Kingpin. Good movie to me. I'm watching that. But like, you know, they were just trying to fit so much in here. You know, there's always kind of that idea I think we talked about where like, also at this time, or just really in general, when you make a superhero film, sometimes you feel like you only got one shot. Like you can only, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, oh, okay, we got to put Bullseye in here. We got to put Kingpin in here. Elektra got to be like, you feel like you got to put everything in here to make fans happy though, too. Because, you know, fans who read Daredevil are going to be like, Elektra's in the movie, Bullseye in the movie, Kingpin, like they're going to like that stuff. But is it a good movie at the end because you added all those components? Did you give all those characters enough time? So when I think about that third act, I really like it because it feels like, it does feel like what beginning season 1 of Daredevil. We get Kingpin and Daredevil. You know what I'm saying? So I really wish that was the movie. Low key, a lot of the action in this movie is okay.
Yeah, it's pretty decent. It's pretty decent stuff.
I was like, huh. Of course, there's still some of that like quick cut. Your head shouldn't have been moving that way. I don't know why we quick cut to that moment, you know, thing happening. But there was some cool stuff happening, man. Some stuff, again, sometimes wasn't comprehensible, didn't make sense. Like the moment Bullseye took one paperclip and hit a nigga with like 8 needles. That doesn't make any sense. I'm like, that was one paperclip, bro. You had like, that doesn't make any sense. But a lot of it was cool. A lot of it made sense. A lot of it did kind of reminisce of what Daredevil was supposed to be with the batons and the way he was fighting and throwing them and flipping. I was like, yeah. A lot of this action is cool. So yeah, I just think if the story was better around it, we would look at the movie different because the action was kind of doing okay, at least what it needed to do in a lot of those moments. This was happened after or what happened before that was like, okay, but what? Or, okay, but how do we get here? So yeah, I kind of appreciated a lot of that, you know, on the ground action. I think a lot of it made sense.
I really like the first big action sequence. I think it's only in the director's cut, not the theatrical cut, but the scene in the pool hall, you know, when he's you know, sort of invest. That's a really, really great sequence. I'm like, oh wow, they actually achieved a lot here. And really, really Again, I think associate all of that hand-to-hand combat, that great choreography with the character that we expect to see. It really came out in that sequence. But yeah, ultimately this movie, it did come out, like I said, Valentine's Day of 2003, and it was modestly successful in terms of the finances. Production budget $78 million, makes $179 million worldwide. So technically, when you compare it to what it cost to make, it did make its money back and then some, but it was just not well received at all. It only got a 43% positive feedback from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, on Metacritic. It had an average score of 42 out of 100, and audiences gave it a B for cinema score on the A+ to F scale. So just not great reception. It went on to be the 29th highest grossing movie of 2003 with its total budget. It's hovering around the area of The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Kill Bill Volume 1, and The Haunted Mansion. So it's sort of in the same company as those films. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, another 20th Century Fox superhero movie that was just a complete disaster. Pretty much made Sean Connery retire from Hollywood. Like, if you can make Sean Connery say, like, I don't want to act anymore, you've done something, because goddamn.